Goldman then turns to looking at what anarchism has to offer, at least on her view. So she focuses on, in large part, labor. Many anarchists also do this, where the concern is about how the system of capitalism, which they are critical of, how it is so harmful to the workers. And so what she asserts that anarchism is trying to do is change labor. So it's no longer deadening, dulling, and it's no longer gloom and compulsion. So what is it supposed to be under the anarchist? Well, she asserts that her hope is to make work an instrument of joy, strength, color, and harmony. So all will find recreation and hope in work. Now again, this is a common view among the left to make things better for the workers. And a reasonable question, a critical question to ask is, would this be possible? Considering the problem of there's many jobs that are unpleasant and many things that have to be done that are not very enjoyable. For example, having to dig the ditches, having to pick fruit and vegetables and so forth, that's not super fun. And so there is the practical challenge of addressing that. So how is she going to bring this about? Well, the solution, according to her, is getting rid of government with its unjust, arbitrary, repressive measures. So the claim is that if anarchism can destroy government and laws, this will rescue the self-respect and independence of individuals and from the dangers of authority and make people free. And she asserts that only in this freedom can people grow to their full stature, learn to think, and give their best, and realize that the true force of the social bonds that knit people together, these are the true foundations of normal social life. And so the assertion is essentially getting rid of government to set people free from the oppression of government. Now again, I've drawn comparisons to libertarians and thinkers on the right, and they do, interestingly enough, raise kind of similar arguments. They talk about government restricting people's individual liberties, and in order for people to be free, these infringements must be pushed back. They also, of course, apply the same thing to business, regulation of business, say environmental concerns, safety concerns, etc. The government must also be freed. And so if freedom is a good thing and has beneficial effects, this would be seen to be something that the anarchists and libertarians and people that are a bit to the right could agree on, that reducing government is good. And the anarchists kind of say in a way that, well, if small government is good, then no government is better. Which is something, of course, that both of these would need to be argued. Goldman now turns to looking at another common objection against anarchism, which is this. There is the idea that human nature is such that people are terrible, and you need the state to keep people under control and in line. This argument was probably best made by Thomas Hobbes. In his Leviathan, he essentially argues, crudely put, that people are in a way terrible and exist in a state of war against all, and until we have a sovereign who would give the power essentially to kill us, to maintain order, everything will be chaos. And so we need a sovereign essentially because we're awful, and we need the iron fist to keep us in line. And so kind of a stark argument against anarchists is that you need the state to keep people in line because people are horrible. So what's her response to this? Well, her assertion is that people have committed horrible crimes in the name of this alleged human nature, and that the greater the charlatan, she asserts, the more definite their insistence on how wicked and weak humans are. And so this does raise a fair question about what is human nature. And again, Thomas Hobbes took the view that people are essentially, horrible. If left unchecked, it would be a war of all against all, in a state of war in which life would be nasty, brutish, and short. And we can only stop this by, creating a sovereign to essentially keep us in line with violence. And so that does raise the question about what is truly human nature, because Hobbes's view, again, people are terrible, but John Locke, a British thinker as well, took the view that people are, they do have their issues, but people are basically not terrible. And he has a much more positive view of human nature. And this is something that's a matter of great debate in ethical theory. For example, Aristotle takes people to be basically neutral, and they can become good or bad, virtuous or full of vice. One of Confucius's students, Mencius, claims that people are basically good, and you have to just keep them from going into badness. Jean-Jacques Rousseau had a similar view, people are basically good, and he was very critical of the state, civilization corrupting people. And then you have people like Thomas Hobbes and similar thinkers who regard people as essentially terrible. But in terms of knowing what human nature is, because these thinkers typically used a theoretical device called the state of nature, in which you'd kind of imagine what things were like before civilization. And it simply is imagination. So what are people in fact like without civilization? And Goldman points out, and I think correctly, that if we look at our current civilization, and she puts it, very dramatically, with every soul in a prison, with every heart fettered, wounded, and maimed, we can't speak of human nature. Now, she does make a good point. We really can't talk about what humans are naturally like, because what we always see is humans in a civil society or uncivil society in which they're affected by all these forces. So can we say what people would be like naturally, given that we always find people in some sort of political system, and often terrible ones? She notes John Burroughs' experimental study of animals, Burroughs made the claim that if you're studying animals in captivity, and again, this is long ago, before this became somewhat an accepted mainstream view, he noted that animals in captivity, their character, habits, appetites, etc., undergo a complete transformation. So if we're going to try to study the natural behavior of animals, and we try to do so like in zoos or in cage labs, we're not going to know what animals are like. And by analogy, Goldman reasons, with human nature, caged in a narrow space, whipped into submission, we cannot speak of its potentialities. And so her assertion is, when people say humans are terrible and awful, and the state must, keep them in line, we can't have this freedom. Her assertion essentially is that people are behaving terribly, not out of human nature, but because of the conditions under which they exist. And if people were set free, then we could see real human nature. Now, at this point, a critic might say, well, we do see people when they're free. We see at, protests and riots, and when people are free, they're burning buildings, they're looting targets, etc. They're terrible. They're animals that must be crushed. And that is a commonly held view, that the riot, the protest, reveals human nature. But of course, Goldman would no doubt say back, well, no, that doesn't reveal human nature. That reveals how people respond who have been, horribly mistreated, have been, caged and abused, metaphorically and also literally. What happens when they're able to break out? And you really can't judge what people would be like in natural free circumstances based on how they behave when finally, for a brief moment, they're free of the, crushing oppression that they live under. And of course, Goldman could also point to how many of the protests are peaceful, and that when people set up, the Chaz is getting quite a bit of attention, and one narrative is from the right, using objectively shown to be modified digital images, and actually quoting someone who is clearly joking, talking about a quote from Monty Python, which they didn't realize was from Monty Python, the British, comedy group, that to try to cast them as, violent and terrible. But the reality, at least so far, seems to be that they are not violent and terrible. In many ways, they're acting like Goldman would predict. When people are not being oppressed, they tend to be far more peaceful. But again, this is a matter of, ongoing long historical debate about what people truly are like, And I think Goldman is quite right. You can't know what people are like when people are being, kept in order, oppressed, etc. You need to look at people in freedom. And it may turn out that, Thomas Hobbes is right. People just, if you set people, completely free, everything is terrible. Or maybe the thinkers like Locke and Mencius and Rousseau were right. That if you let people free, then they'll be better than they are under oppression. So Goldman's view is that we can't really talk about human nature until we're free, and she does seem to be right about that. Goldman once again presents what she takes anarchism to stand for, that's to say what it aims to do. And much of this is, of course, responding to the pernicious influences she criticized earlier. So, for her, anarchism stands for the liberation of the human mind from the dominion of religion, liberation of the human body from the dominion of property, liberation from the shackles and restraint of government, and what they'll provide in terms of the positive program, a social order based on the free grouping of individuals for the purpose of producing real social wealth. And she claims, and critics, of course, will say this is unrealistic, she claims there'll be an order that will guarantee to all free access to the earth and enjoyment of the necessities of life according to individual desires, tastes, and inclinations. And again, this is one of the main battles in political thought, because even though, of course, we hear the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, talking about the pursuit of happiness, and we have thinkers like John Locke begin by talking about property with all things shared in common. The idea that everyone would have access to everything according to desires, taste, and inclinations is often criticized in various ways. And anarchists and other left-leaning thinkers think this is a possibility, and conservatives generally think that it is impossible, that you must always have a very few who have pretty much everything, and the notion of everyone having access to everything was just simply either impossible or undesirable. So how are the anarchists going to bring this about? And critics, again, often say that the anarchists are presenting utopia. Those would be the most, perhaps, gentle critics. And others say, they're proposing something terrible that would end up with, people not working at all and just simply taking everything, ending in, chaos and madness. So how do the anarchists propose to bring about this, what they regard as a better world? Well, in democracies, the general idea is that you use the political machinery. You use, voting, either casting ballots or running for office. Now, Goldman rejects both of these. What's her reasoning? Well, in terms of voting, she follows Henry David Thoreau, who is very critical of voting. He asserted that voting is essentially gaming, playing with right and wrong, essentially gambling. The idea, as he saw, was basically like this. When you cast a ballot, even if you're voting for the right thing, he says you're not really doing anything for it. It's like playing the lottery. If you buy a lottery ticket, you're not really doing much of anything to get money. You're just kind of hoping that you'll win. And Thoreau says voting is kind of the same way. When you cast your single ballot and you're voting for what you think is right, you're hoping that you'll get a winning ticket, that your side will somehow have the most votes, or have the most votes counted. And so Thoreau asserts that a wise person won't leave this to the chance of the ballot box, and also he claims, nor will they wish it to prevail just through the power of the majority, just, having more people happen to vote for it. And she claims that, according to Thoreau and others, that if you look at the history of voting, that only shows failure and defeat, not even one reform to reduce economic and social stress of the people. Now, this, of course, is a empirical matter. Has this, in fact, been done? And today, of course, people would probably say, well, yes, there's been, much in the way of reform. Many laws have been passed to reduce economic and social stress of the people. Now, Goldman has a counter to this. She does assert that there have been laws passed and enactments made for the protection of, labor, which in a way seems to, contrast, what you said before, although you could separate out what, reform and law. But her distinction seems to be this. There are laws that have been passed, but she claims this has really resulted in no positive change. And she gives the example, from her time, where child labor laws prevail, child exploitation is at its highest. And she gives you the example of the United States, where workers enjoy full political opportunities, but capitalism has reached its zenith. And so assertion is that even though laws get passed, there are no true reforms, that there are not results. And so she does raise, this raises an important concern about how one brings about change. And her assertion is that voting doesn't work. One, Thoreau's criticism is essentially just gambling, hoping that your side will win by more people happening to vote that day and have their votes counted. And her other criticism is that even if laws are passed, there's really not true reform, that these results don't come into place. And connecting it to the protest of today, people are making similar points, that we've had all these attempts and efforts at reforming the policing in the United States, economics in the United States, and little as practical has actually come of this. That although perhaps we have laws, that the reforms are not truly there. So Goldman rejects voting. Now what about representation, getting people in office? Because one thing they often say, they tell people to vote, and they also tell people who want to make a difference, don't protest, go out and run for office. So what about that? Getting political power within the system. Well, Goldman is critical of that. What's her reasoning? Well, her claim is this. The chance of having a representative that is honest and good is slight. Now, what if you do happen to elect people with integrity? Well, she says there's two possibilities. One possibility is they'll become corrupt and be corrupted by, the system. And, by the needs of, not all at once perhaps, but by the needs of, taking the United States as an example, the needs to raise massive amounts of money to get reelected, and that, people have contended, leads to corruption, and of course of all the temptations of office. But what about people who do manage to resist and maintain their integrity? Well, what she asserts here is, well, if someone maintains their integrity, they would have no influence at all. So it creates a, unpleasant dilemma. Either one loses one's integrity and becomes corrupt, but effective, but not effective for the people, or they maintain their integrity and are effectively, useless, or so she claims. This, of course, would be an empirical matter. You could look at, people who get elected who seem to have integrity and see what happens. Do they lose their integrity and become corrupt? Do they become incapable of exerting the slightest influence, or do they have an effect? And this is something that's, debated even now, because, there are people who have run for office who got elected who are being presented as, being for change, like, for example, AOC. And the question is, will they be able to make a difference? I mean, they get a fair amount of attention from the media and from, people who are critical of them. But a question would be, will they remain true to their integrity, or will they, be able to do nothing, or will they be actually able to accomplish things? Now, some critics would say that the anarchists, are giving up too easy. They should have more faith in voting and representation. And the anarchists will say back, well, history proves otherwise. So what then are, according to the anarchists, what should people do? Well, they advocate direct action, quoting Stirner, that man has as much liberty as he's willing to take. And anarchism, as it is asserted, offers direct action in open defiance of and resistance to laws and restrictions, economic, social, and moral. This defiance and resistance is illegal, and she asserts, perhaps by, in a way, glorifying, breaking the law, and she says, there lies the salvation of man. Everything illegal necessitates integrity, self-reliance, and courage. It calls for free, independent spirits, for men who are men, and who have a bone in their backs. Now, a critic, of course, would point out, well, surely it's not true that everything illegal necessitates integrity, self-reliance, and courage, because there are all sorts of really terrible crimes that clearly do not involve integrity. Like assault, sexual assault, murder, and so on. But what she, seems to be meaning is not that. Although whenever you use like an all, that opens up for easy criticism. That the defiance and resistance of the problematic laws and restrictions, one could say that does require integrity, self-reliance, and courage, which seems true. If you look at the protests today, to go and protest runs the risk of, even if you're completely peaceful, of the local authorities deciding that to roll out the riot police with armored vehicles, firing rubber bullets, which are less lethal options, and tear gas, and beating people with sticks. And so that does in fact require courage to get out there and face the real possibility of being badly injured by the riot police. And so she advocates direct action. Now, in defense of direct action, she offers an argument by example, which of course involves giving examples that support the claim being made. And even though she speaks against voting, she does note that universal suffrage owed its existence to direct action. She notes that American independence owed its existence to rebellion and defiance, essentially direct action. One thing that people often do that defend protest is they draw the clear analogy to the American resistance against, the British, when America, what is now America, was a colony, and the colonists sought redress for the offenses against them, the mistreatment, etc., and first tried peaceful means, trying to do it through, petitions and voting and so forth. But of course, we know how that played out. And supporters of the protesters often make the point that that is what is required is direct action. And she, of course, also uses the example of John Brown and asserts that the direct action of John Brown and then later direct action led to the end of slavery, because there were efforts to reform the system, efforts to do it through political means. But of course, what occurred was the South, in order to defend slavery, decided to secede from the Union, engage in rebellion against the United States, with some military personnel who had sworn an oath to the Constitution of the United States, betraying their oath and becoming, in effect, clearly traitors, turning against the country to which they'd sworn an oath. And of course, the South was defeated during this war, and slavery was ended. And then, of course, Lincoln was assassinated. We had the, South kind of rebuild. We had the Southern strategy. And, of course, we had Jim Crow. And we had the, erection of Confederate monuments in fairly recent history. And, of course, we get the racism that we have ongoing today. And people can argue that direct action is still needed. She also points to trade unions, how they succeeded by direct action. And that is true. In the when unions were organizing, police would be sent to attack, viciously and savagely attack workers, using violence against them. And the history of unions in the United States is not one that gets a lot of coverage in most classes, but it's a history of brutal and violent struggle between workers and the forces of the state serving the interest of the companies. And so she asserts that direct action will lead to revolution, and no real social change has ever come about without it. And so she advocates direct action, and again uses examples from the United States, namely voting, American independence, the end of slavery, and trade unions. And as one might imagine, These things are often disliked and despised by some who oppose such things. So that takes us to the end of Goldman's anarchism and our advocacy for the elimination of government through direct action.